As had been laid out in the previous video installation of this series regarding the actions occurring within the southeast of the city of Fort Worth, there were 4 different American companies, 3 of the 949th Brigade Support Battalion, including the Bravo and Delta companies, as well as also its Alpha Company, which was bivouacked along with the HHC, which was the headquarters of Headquarters Company over the entire 56th Infantry Brigade combat team, and ultimately over all the defending forces within the Metroplex as a whole, which included even the 2 attached battalions, the Armored Battalion, the 2nd of the 198th from the 155th Armored Brigade Combat Team, as well as the 1st of the 204th of the 66th Troop Command of the Mississippi National Guard. As the initial impacts of the 2 WS-35R rocket-assisted satellite-guided shells had smashed into the communications tents and communications equipment, the communications arrays of the 2 bivouac sites of the 949th and the HHC elements, as also passers-by, having had traveled the roads adjacent to the downtown of Fort Worth, having had witnessed the air assault activities occurring by PLA air assault forces, as well as seeing other elements of the air assault forces passing overhead en route to the DFW International Airport, had moved rapidly through the area, departing to inform these American forces, whom they knew were in the area as before the invasion had even initiated. The Sino-Russian naval drills occurring off both coasts had prompted the defending forces to be deployed throughout the urban area, including within the DFW area and many others. And this had made the news, and as a result, many of the locals in each of these areas were relatively well informed upon where these forces had been temporarily posted. As it pertained to the 949th Brigade Support Battalion elements, the Bravo and Delta Company, had the invasion not initiated at this time, would have eventually ended up going to ultimately different sites, including the Bravo Company going to the Meacham International Airport and the Delta Company going to Love Field to be able to support the different elements within these areas, as the Alpha Company of the 949th, along with the HHC over the entire 56th, would have ultimately themselves moved into the DFW International Airport, which was highly coveted by the PLA every bit as much as it was by the local defending American forces. As the clock had struck 1 a.m., the battle had officially begun in the southeast of the city of Fort Worth, as avoiding the most direct route to reach the Naval Air Station, the forces of the 949th and the HHC, these 4 companies, had in effect rendezvoused within the southeast of the city, planning on going west to I-820 and taking it to the relative safety of the Naval Air Station, or so they thought. As a matter of fact, the Naval Air Station at this time was under a withering, gargantuan, brutal assault by everything from air power to missile strikes to ground forces, including also heavy artillery, as elements of the 19th Artillery Brigade were striking the area as well. As a result of all of this, these forces, in their bid to reach the Naval Air Station, believing falsely that it was safe, had moved into the southeast of the city, where they were monitored every step of the way, as mentioned in the previous installation, as the 59th Special Operations Battalion was guided in through the use of the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, which itself was connected to the gargantuan surveillance apparatus, which were the PLA and Coalition's ISR capabilities, being the eyes and proverbial ears of the Coalition forces, through the use of the real-time AI battlefield data processing system. This enabled these forces to hurriedly interdict, cut off, surround, and then ultimately destroy these forces, along with groupings of armed reactionary civilians, numbering a grand total of 550 within this pocket, as this single Special Operations Battalion had surrounded the area they would take roughly an hour to thoroughly plug up at each and every gap in this envelopment, this cordon around these forces, and they would have heavy artillery support from elements of the 19th Artillery Brigade, namely two of their battalions of the Type 83 multiple launch rocket systems, which three firing batteries from these two battalions, two batteries from one and one from the other, would rain down a withering barrage of 122 millimeter rocket strikes into the area to savagely wipe out many combatants. Although this would be largely the case in the north of the pocket, the south of the pocket would be cleared far more methodically without the use of such very powerful firepower as heavy artillery forces, and would rely more specifically on the Special Operations Forces and their direct firepower, along with the assistance of two combat drones, namely the Wing-Loon 2 dedicated combat drones, as there were dozens over this particular battle space, as dozens were required for precision ATGM support. These would be favored over the use of more potent PLAAF assets, which dropped or fired far more powerful munitions, as ATGMs were seen as far more surgical and precise, as the destruction these created were far less than a pair of 1,000-pound laser-guided precision munitions or KD-88 standoff air-to-ground cruise missiles, for example. As the battle initiated with the arrival of the first two companies of the 59th Special Operations Battalion, they had in effect clashed with the advanced scouting forces of the 949th Brigade Support Battalion elements and the HHC company that was with them. And as a result, they held these forces through interdiction while allowing the rest of their companies to hurriedly surround the area within 30 minutes, taking another 30 minutes or roughly a full hour from 1 a.m. to 2 a.m. to thoroughly plug up all the gaps after the companies had arrived in position in a matter of 30 minutes, as they had to dismount all their mounted up forces from their MRAPs and EQ 2050 high mobility military vehicles, which were China's equivalent of the Humvee. These forces, as the MRAPs of these companies and EQ 2050s had surrounded the area in 30 minutes, would take an additional 30 minutes to deploy all their dismounts to again plug up every alley, street, and building that was on the edges of the envelopment, as the PLA forces had a variety of means of support within their own battalion. These included their Heavy Special Weapons Company elements, as their Heavy Special Weapons Company included a mortar platoon of 82 millimeter mortars, as well as also an FPV drone operator platoon and sniper spotter platoon, as these were within one platoon as well. And of course, they also had their robotics platoon, which operated both their armed and unarmed robots that were quad-legged systems, as the armed robots carried a very powerful 12.7 millimeter heavy machine gun, and the unarmed robots were effectively systems that were utilized in order to carry around the mortar tubes and base plates and mortars themselves of the Heavy Special Weapons Company's mortar platoon, as this, in effect, in battles that occurred in rough terrain, allowed these mortar forces to access rough terrain with the use of these quad-legged robot systems where vehicles could not potentially reach. However, in the city, these would still be utilized alongside of their EQ 2050 vehicles, which carried the unarmed and armed robots of the Heavy Special Weapons Company in the back, as many of these EQ 2050s had open backs in order to have extra seating for the ability for an EQ 2050 to carry a full squad of 10 troops or to carry one of these robots and the equipment, as also the sniper spotter forces were armed with a combination of the Jiangxi JS 7.62 by 54 millimeter bolt action rifles, which were sniper rifles, or the QBU 10 12.7 millimeter rifles, which had a vastly more increased range and power to them as well. as the sniper spotter team in this particular image had moved into a recently cleared building, as evidenced by the holes in the walls from exchanges of fire, and had set up by flipping off the mattress from this bed and sitting up on top of it in the back of the room so that they could be relatively well hidden in the dark, as this room would have been very dark, as this sniper is wearing his NVGs in this particular room, as again the lights were out. The grid had been removed through the use of the tandem anti-sat and cyber strikes, which also removed the ISR capabilities in the form of satellites and more. As these forces set up further back in these dark rooms or even on building tops, they would be in excellent positions for supporting their troops of their standard operator companies that would be maneuvering through these areas on the ground. As combat would break out throughout this part of the city, which was an unflattering part of the city, to say the least. Many called it the hood. There were a number of low-budget apartment complexes, such as this painted stucco building here. This was a quadplex, as there were multiple quadplexes in an apartment complex, with a hilly terrain here in the background, a undeveloped lot of hills that separated this side of this neighborhood from other parts of the city in this area, as evidenced by the dark silhouettes of buildings in the night sky, with one having had caught fire, ostensibly hit by a mortar or some other system and catching fire to a gas line or perhaps a propane tank or some other type of means of igniting fires, as there were multiple accelerants that could start fires. These forces would swiftly and methodically move through the area, clearing many buildings. And although the operation would take a total of 3.5 hours to complete, in a matter of speaking, this was still a very high tempo of operations for the level of precision that was in effect being carried out, as these forces would move through the area in their various tactical formations, just as ordinary infantry forces of the PLA or others would. These forces would storm many buildings in the area, and in this particular image, a half squad or a stack team is pressed up against the building, partially having cover and concealment from this dumpster in the way of enemy personnel off in the distance, as another full squad is moving in the area with an armed quad-legged robot from the heavy weapons and support company, or special weapons company, leading and laying down heavy fire support, as this individual's cranium has in effect exploded into a cloudy mist of blood and bone fragments from being impacted by a 12.7 millimeter round from this quad-legged robot, while this light machine gunner with his QBJ-201 is also laying down fire on other personnel that are trying to take cover on this hilly terrain, as the rest of this squad had cleared the building and was on the other side of this particular quadplex. These personnel had exited the building and were taking cover along the wall, while these personnel advanced with their quad-legged robot leading the way, laying down heavy fire support as they would rip through what remained of this fence and be able to pass through as a squad along with their robot. Many of these vehicles, be they the MRAPs or EQ-2050s, had basic issue items, or BII, such as bolt cutters and other types of tools which could be utilized from these vehicles by the special operators to cut fences or obstructions that were in the way, as they also had breach kits as well that could be used on heavier doors, such as handheld battering rams and other pieces of equipment. Oftentimes, these were not really required for these forces to fulfill their operations, although they were available. As the operations were now well underway, and the combat was very heavy within the pocket, as again, the 6 standard operator companies had surrounded a relatively large area within the southeast of the city of Fort Worth, which included the public housing projects in a part of the city known as Stop 6 in this particular area, which in effect was the hood, filled with hole-in-the-wall bars and clubs and game rooms and dollar stores and grocery stores, such as in the shopping center here, also car stereo stores, pawn shops, gas stations, even a metal recycling plant, and many more buildings that one would find in the inner city, as these public housing projects were primarily brick buildings as the American forces moved through the area. And initially, their advanced scouts had bumped into special operators, with a few making it back alive to inform the rest of Alpha Company and HHC forces that had in effect moved into this area to link up originally with the Bravo Company and Delta, which would be heavily annihilated and showered by 122mm rocket artillery strikes, were to have linked up and moved again to the west together to reach IA-20 to reach the Naval Air Station, going around the reported PLA activity in the downtown, as again, the civilians, having traveled on their common travel through this area around midnight, had hurriedly moved through to tell these forces of the goings-on. As in other parts of the city, the flanks were being cleared for operations that were taking place to capture major objectives, such as all of these sites of the downtowns of Fort Worth, Dallas, as well as also the DFW International Airport, Meacham International Airport, Love Field, as well as, which would be taken after the downtown was captured, as well as also the Naval Air Station, and many industrial sites that were key targets being hit by a combination of missile strikes, heavy strategic bomber strikes, and in some instances also strike aircraft strikes, as well as also ground attacks from artillery strikes and more. As all of this was unfolding, and to the south, PLA forces from the 16th ID were capturing a key segment of the main invasion route known as I-35W, as I-35E was also a part of the same highway, where the highway had split into two parts. These highway segments throughout the whole node were to be absolutely and thoroughly secured, along with the other objectives such as the two red zones, the downtown of Fort Worth and the downtown of Dallas, along with the future mega FOBs, which were the major airports such as Love Field, the DFW International, which was the biggest of all, and of course Meacham International. Of course, the Naval Air Station would likewise be occupied, and portable buildings built in place of the shattered remains of this installation. As all of these would become large forward operating bases, even the Taylor Army heliport. The fighting in this area was mostly geared towards securing high-value individuals, or HVTs, high-value targets. And in this case, it was also about decapitating the defending forces and their chain of command, going after command and control assets, which not only included severing their communications through the initial tandem anti-SAT cyber strikes and electronic warfare assets, but also literally smashing any communications equipment as a standard operating procedure, as well as also capturing or rarely eliminating the commanding leadership of these different units, as in this case, the commander of the entire defenses of the DFW area was wanted alive, as was his staff, including his executive officer, also the command sergeant major within the brigade, and others, as there were other officers within the HHC. As the inner circle of the commanding general, as again, in the U.S. Army, colonels mostly commanded brigades, although there were still brigadier generals that commanded brigades, and in this instance, the 56th had a brigadier general in command of this brigade and the attached units, the two additional battalions, and he was wanted alive, along with the rest of his inner circle within the HHC, which is why the northern half of the pocket would be more thoroughly ravaged than would the southern portion of the pocket, because in the south, the ISR capabilities of the PLA had been following vigorously all of the movements of the commanding general and knew his rough location at all times, as they had total ISR, AI, and IT dominance. They had seen the general's vehicle and monitored everywhere it was traveling. And as they had seen his vehicle and entourage move into the public housing projects in the Stop 6 area, they had opted to clear this specific area much more methodically and thoroughly after first eliminating the northern portion of the pocket, wherein the Bravo and Delta Company had become effectively cut off from the Alpha Company and HHC, which were to the south in the Stop 6 area south of I-30. And also, as a secondary objective, again, I-30 was to be secured and would thoroughly be secured by the Special Operations troops, especially upon having had won their victory in the northern portion of the pocket, where heavy combat would ensue against the defending forces, as again, the PLA troops were elite troops of these Special Operations Forces, many of them having had before becoming reservists in China's massive ready reserve of group armies, had served tours upon being in active duty through special operations units that had rotated through the Syrian civil conflict in the late 20-teens, as China had made several deployments of special operations forces to assist the Assad regime during the late 20-teens, and some of these troops had effectively ended their contracts in the active duty forces and transferred into the ready reserve forces, becoming part of some of these special operations forces, including those within the 59th PLA Group Army Special Operations Battalion. And as these forces would lay down heavy firepower with their high-tech capabilities in the form of combat robots, FPV drones, loitering munitions such as CH-901As, with their total AI dominance and ISR dominance, which was also another factor of high technology, these strikes with their mortars, FPV drones, loitering munitions, and their use of combat robots as well, and sniper spotter teams working in tandem through the use of the real-time AI battlefield data processing system would be operating at a level of precision never before imaginable, as all these forces would focus their firepower, concentrating it on specific target areas and smashing their way through, slicing through the defending forces with relative ease, as the Special Operations Forces were a very adept force at fighting as a team, as these, again, were some of the most elite troops within the PLA forces, although the active duty Special Operations Forces were even a step up from these. These forces were the best of the best of the 59th PLA active or reserve group army rather, and were fighting to achieve success in this particular high stakes, precision oriented operation of taking HVTs alive, if at all humanly possible. As now, on this particular map, one of the first two companies to arrive to interdict the movements of Bravo and Delta, which would be heavily rocketed through the pre-prepared strike packages put together through the ISR battlefield data processing system, would also destroy 300 armed reactionary civilians, along with tens of thousands of non-combatants as collateral damage. Again, non-combatants were not targeted specifically, although if they were in the way, they were viewed as collateral damage. And over 20,000 would perish in this rocket barrage conducted by 3 firing batteries from the 2 different Type 83 multiple launch rocket system battalions, which were part of the 19th Artillery Brigade within the PLA's 59th Group Army. As this had been unfolding, one platoon of these 3 combat platoons from one company from within the 59th Special Operations Battalion had deployed their dismounts to clear flanks in this area, while the 2 additional platoons that were still mounted up, along with the vehicles of the platoon having had dismounted their squads, would continue ahead to surgically cut off and destroy the Bravo Company, which again was a support and logistical element and were non-combat troops. their most capable combat vehicles being 4 Max Pro MRAP gun trucks, and of course the vehicles that utilized by their platoon leaders and their company captain being up-armored Humvees, as their platoon leaders were second lieutenants, or in some cases a first lieutenant, as the XO of this company was a first lieutenant, and the company captain was the commander of the company, and the first sergeant would be, in effect, with the company captain at this very moment, trying to discuss their course of action as a company, as the rocket barrage was coming in immediately behind their position to the slight east, as buildings were ravaged by heavy concentrated 122mm multiple launch system fires from the Type 83 multiple launch rocket systems. This would completely annihilate all of the Delta Company, as well as also, again, 300 additional armed reactionary civilian elements that would be caught up in this barrage. As also, again, thousands of non-combatants would perish, literally in the tens of thousands, as it would be over 20,000 in this barrage. Again, these would be seen as collateral damage, as these forces would make a desperate attempt to break out of this area. They would be, in effect, stopped, as even beyond this 1 mile north-south by 1.5 mile east-west area, another 2 companies had surrounded the area, spreading out their vehicles, their MRAPs and EQ 2050s, and dismounting their dismounted squads to plug up every alleyway, street, and building on the outer cordon, in effect trapping these forces and enabling the artillery to hit them heavily, as these forces would move up and temporarily hold their position in this spot as the vehicle convoy moved ahead with their staggered weapons for mutual fire support, as they had their quadcopter ISR assets, which each and every vehicle crew and dismounted squad possessed. They would map the area all around them and, in effect, use this to levy enormous concentrated 12.7mm heavy machine gun fire, as well as also in some cases utilizing ATGMs such as the man-portable HJ-08s, which were kept stocked in these MRAPs and EQ 2050s along with Type 69 rocket-propelled grenade systems, as these forces had moved ahead and began to lay down heavy fire on armed reactionary civilian elements. The dismounted squads, with their sniper spotter support, either within buildings or on rooftops, were now beginning to assist the maneuvers of their troops moving through these areas on the ground, as these troops were very thorough and methodical. The actual combat that would occur in this pocket would last only 45 minutes, with there being another 45 minutes taken to conduct security sweeps to ensure the pocket had been thoroughly cleared between the use of the heavy artillery, as the area that had been saturated by rocket fire would be swept, as it was a 1 kilometer east-west by 1 mile north-south area that will have been heavily rocketed. This area would be swept along with the remains of this portion of the pocket by this one company, before they would then maneuver their forces into position to shrink the pocket into this area, as the other 3 companies, having had moved in, again, the advanced scouts had bumped into them, and they were moving into this area to begin the cordon of it before they would surround it. And even by 3:40 a.m., when this map opens up officially, as this is very timeline-oriented, the Mechanized Infantry Company dispatched from the Battalion of Mechanized Infantry from the 16th ID, which had effectively taken the Cowboy Stadium after defeating a moderate-size contingent of armed reactionary civilians there, would send one of its 3 unused mechanized infantry companies, which had been held back for security reasons, as well as also being a reserve force that could be committed anywhere at any time in the area, and thus would be utilized as a reinforcement to the Special Operations troops, as these heavier vehicles of the mechanized infantry such as their very powerful and advanced ZBD-04As, could lay down immense firepower to support the operations occurring, although, again, these forces would not be needed as the Special Operations troops had massive support from their own CH-901A loitering munitions fired by their headquarters and support companies' dedicated combat drone section operating the TEL-based 48-tube system to operate the CH-901As, as well as also their own FPV drone operators, which operated FPV drones throughout the battle space that were part of their heavy special weapons company, as well as also their armed combat robot support. Mortar support, as 82mm mortars would also ravage enemy forces and buildings and light-skinned vehicles in the area, as well as also their sniper spotter support, all working hand in hand with their MRAPs, which were equipped with very powerful weapons, such as the W85 12.7mm heavy machine guns, even the EQ-2050s boasting the same, would be more than enough to secure this area, especially against non-combat forces, as they would cut through them like a hot knife through butter, as these forces, especially utilizing combat robots and drones in tandem, were simply too much for the non-combat troops to contend with, as these non-combat troops were sparsely equipped with any type of anti-armor or anti-tank weapons, as again, these were logistical and support troops. If they had any of these AT-4s or more potent ATGMs, such as tow systems or javelins, it was only because, as logistical forces, they were to transport these to the fighting elements within the 56th Infantry Brigade combat team. And as some of these forces would try to use these AT-4s, as they had no actual ATGMs at this time, only light anti-armor weapons like the AT-4, they would in effect destroy one combat robot, but nothing more, as all of this firepower coming at them, again, highly concentrated, highly team-oriented, would work so well hand in hand that these forces would really not be able to do much, if anything, to resist, as, again, potent air power was available, as a pair of J-11 fighter aircraft were overhead and could have contributed up to 4 laser-guided 1,000-pound precision munitions, but would not be called upon to do so, as the Wing-Loon 2 dedicated combat drones, 2 of which directly supporting this operation, equipped with HJ-10 ATGMs, would be more than enough in terms of precision air support, as these ATGMs were far more surgical than the larger combat aviation-based weaponry aboard fixed-wing aircraft, such as the J-11 and even the strike aircraft like the JH-7s and others. As in this particular area in the south, one Wing-Loon 2 would be operating over the southern portion of the pocket, while in the north there would be another, actually firing 4 of its total of 12 ATGMs aboard at targets just between this area and this area, as concentrated ISR-directed mortar support from the FDC, or forces of the mortar platoon, would be directed through pre-prepared strike packages put together through the ISR capabilities, through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, and would be enormously accurate as a result, as these were the quad-legged non-combat robots which carried the mortar tubes, base plates, and additional ammunition for the 82mm mortar systems into battle for the troops, as they could dismount from the open-backed EQ-2050 vehicles and could move their mortar forces into areas in more open terrain, such as mountain and other forested areas where vehicles couldn't necessarily get to, which was why they used these quad-legged robots, because it saved the personnel from having to carry the enormous extra weight into rough terrain. As in this situation, although they wouldn't necessarily be necessary, as the vehicles could move relatively near where the mortar forces would set up at, including in this rubbled former building, having had already been pummeled by mortars as these forces arrived, they could still serve as additional assistance if and whenever needed in terms of moving the mortar forces into buildings, perhaps such as building tops and more, carrying their equipment in larger buildings for them, although again this wouldn't be necessary in this instance, as there were 2 sniper spotter teams deployed from the Heavy Special Weapons Company that were on rooftops in this particular portion of the battle. They would be engaging to assist their maneuvering dismounted squads. They would be engaging enemy personnel throughout this area and would be heavily assisting them with, again, the use of their 7.62 by 54 millimeter Jiangxi JS rifles, or their very powerful 12.7 millimeter QBU-10 rifles, which had much further range and power, although the Jiangxi was still a great rifle for this particular operation in this area, as the combat occurring within the range of their rifle was such that they could reach virtually all targets on this map from the tallest buildings, which they had taken positions atop. And as the FPV drone operators, as only half of the mortar platoon is shown, with the other 2 firing sections and the FDC forces just off the map with their vehicles. The FPV drone operators were along with them and had already launched their FPVs drones into battle to deal with these forces in this area, as these troops in the staggered column formation move through the backs of these homes, as these were more suburban type of homes in this particular part of the pocket, whereas homes in this area, in the Stop 6 area, were more like shotgun shacks, with this being roughly the end of the suburban type of housing in this hilly terrain along I-30 here. The forces would maneuver through the backyards of these areas and lay down heavy fire with mutually supporting fire and cut these armed reactionary civilian technicals and personnel down with their small arms fire, along with their 35 millimeter grenade fire from beneath the rifles of the troops that carried those, like so, as well as also their rocket-propelled grenade fire from their Chinese Type 69 RPG systems, as well as also, when needed, utilizing HJO-8 ATGMs in combat. These forces were cut down immediately at the opening. They had not had a chance to even engage these forces, and by the time they had reached this position, these forces would mutually support this squad, between this squad and this squad, against these armed reactionary civilian elements here. As the 5 of 15 armed combat robots would maneuver through this area together, they had their weapons oriented in different angles and would assist in shredding through these homes and cutting these forces down, as their firepower too was also ISR directed, and as everything on the battlefield that could be seen could be easily wiped out, these forces, including down in the south here, would cut through their opponents along with the FPV drone support, sniper spotter support, firing at these dismounted personnel and personnel in vehicles, as again, these were some of the best shooters that the PLA had to offer in their special operations forces. Again, they had shooting down to a science, and as a result, between the FPV drone support, mortar support, sniper spotter support, and combat armed robot support, and vehicle-based support from their MRAPs and their heavy machine gun equipped turrets, even the EQ-2050s also boasting 12.7 millimeter heavy machine guns, these forces were effectively unstoppable as they shredded through the opposition in the north from armed reactionary civilian elements. FPV drones continued on to attack the strongest vehicles within the Bravo company, as well as also some of the command vehicles, such as this up-armored Humvee, and this one down here would be engaged by heavy machine gun fire coming in from the lead MRAP as it would move into the area, and mortars would impact in this area as well, causing massive destruction against the facades of buildings like so, and destroying soft-skinned vehicles, and badly damaging the up-armored Humvee, such as shredding up its tires as the heavy machine gun fire began to impact it as well. As all of this was going on, these two squads here, this rolling T and this wedge, began to bound and cover tactically until they reached the end of the street and laid down fire on these personnel here, getting the drop on them as they moved. They were firing as they moved because they already knew with their quadcopter ISR satellite or ISR drones running circuits, they were capable of seeing these forces first and were thereby able to rapidly engage them, along with FPV drones coming in and impacting as well. As these personnel tried to flee, as sniper fire had cut some of their forces down, including down here losing a man to a sniper fire, and would lose another of the 3 survivors to another sniper's round. These forces, running into these forces as they knew they were there and were coming, they would have a wounded man who would end up taking a pistol round to the face. Combat medics would be deployed, and an armored ambulance would roll in from the headquarters and support company as the combat medics would stabilize this soldier, put him in the armored ambulance, and roll him out. The squad would still be combat effective with 9 men remaining, but they would hold their position here after cutting the rest of these personnel down. They would hold their position here and would be able to have a field of fire overlooking this street right here and preventing any personnel from moving up through this area, through this street, as they also had cut down the last 2 survivors after the sniper had gotten 1 of 3 survivors after the first had been eliminated by a sniper round. They had cut down the final 2 men here. Mortar fire, repeated strikes from 82mm mortars had cut down all of these dismounts. More mortar strikes in this area had cut down these dismounts, having had come out of this building, the building being destroyed along with them, this additional house beside it being badly damaged on this side, as these FPV drones had destroyed these armed reactionary civilian vehicles, as well as also fire coming from these troops, these dismounts, cutting this vehicle up with small arms fire and a Type 69 anti-armor RPG round. These forces, these 2 squads, would continue bounding and covering tactically past this gas station and the shop and these backyards of these homes after cutting these personnel down with mutually supporting fire. And then this squad would eventually move into this area as at the same time this was occurring, these 3 combat platoons broke into their single platoon elements, one moving south, one moving north, and one moving directly ahead, as this vehicle by now had been destroyed by the heavy fire laid down from the gunner, as well as also deploying an HJ-08 from the turret and destroying the remains of this vehicle after it had been heavily peppered by a combination of 12.7mm fire, even repeated mortar strikes against it. They had finished off the remains of this command vehicle with an HJ-08 round, and as this platoon moved north, they had cut off fleeing combatants from the Bravo Company, as these fleeing American troops were engaged by interlocking fields of fire from the MRAPs of this platoon, as 5 had moved in this direction, 5 in this direction, the other 5 straight ahead. As all of this was going on, these FPV drones and repeated multiple mortar strikes had impacted this area and had completely cut these personnel all down with their soft-skin vehicles, such as LMTVs, HETs, which were heavy equipment transporter trucks. Their M88 armored recovery vehicle was destroyed, their MRAPs destroyed by FPV drones, and their dismounted troops. These had been destroyed at the opening by the shrapnel from the rockets impacting closest to their position, and a mortar strike had finished off the rest as they had moved here. As this command vehicle tried to effectively leave the area, they were cut off and engaged by this platoon. After the armed combat robots had made it to this position when these vehicles were here, they had ceased fire, allowing them to move through this area as they had been laying down fire on the remains of these forces, as by then these MRAPs had been destroyed. And again, these troops would manage to fire one of their AT-4s, destroying one of these armed combat robots, but there would still be 4 remaining, and they would continue laying down fire as these vehicles moved up to this street to interdict this fleeing vehicle, which by this time these troops had already been hit by mortar strikes. As these forces tried to maneuver, they were hit by mortar strikes, and again, the FPV drones had destroyed the heaviest of the vehicles in this area, the MRAPs, and the up-armored Humvee that was right here, which had the captain and first sergeant. Again, The leadership in this company had virtually no importance to the PLA forces, unlike the HHC's leadership, which now had been hiding out in the public housing projects, which would be stormed shortly after combat had finished in the northern part of the pocket, as combat in the projects would be initiated by a platoon of standard operators with heavy support coming from their headquarters and support companies, Combat Drone Section, firing a volley of 48 CH-901As with HE warheads, which were enough to destroy the MRAPs and also the up-armored Humvees, as well as also HJ-10 ATGMs fired from this particular Wingloon 2 dedicated combat drone, as the other one that had assisted in the north had hit armed reactionary civilians that were in between this particular area and this particular area. And mortar strikes were happening in this area as well, as there were very tiny groups of armed reactionary civilians between this map and this map. They still had to be engaged and destroyed, as these forces would then, after achieving victory in the northern portion of the pocket, would conduct their security sweeps between dismounting the last two platoons that still had troops mounted up, as the lead platoon had dismounted their squads. These squads would also assist in the sweeps as well, before again the mortar platoon of the Heavy Special Weapons Company would pack up and then move and change positions to the old schoolhouse, which was on very high hilly terrain on the other side of I-30, as the rest of the platoon would be just off the map in this area that would also be cleared between 2:30 and 3:30, as this map opens up 3:40 with the arrival of the mechanized infantry company sent in as reinforcements, as this command came from higher up to send in this company as reinforcements, coming directly from the headquarters of Headquarters Battalion, which was the command and administrative forces over the whole 59th PLA Group Army, to send this company in to assist in this operation. Again, the commanding elements over the 59th Group Army placed enormous emphasis on this precision operation to capture the leadership of the American HHC of the 56th Infantry Brigade Combat Team, who were now hiding in the public housing projects, and they were wanted alive because they had enormous intelligence value, like many other high-ranking officials, as well as high-ranking military personnel. And due to the status of this Brigadier General commanding all the defending forces in this area, as the 59th would go on to be the occupation forces after their victory over this area, they needed all the intel assistance that they could get alongside what they already had through open source intelligence, hacked intelligence through the cyber warfare arm of the PLA, and other human intelligence. This would be a part of the human intelligence component, as they would conduct rigorous interrogations on these high-ranking officials and officers to find out everything they could in order to put their planning together to crush any and all opposition that would naturally arise after their victory, as they had understood that there would be partisan uprisings. They just had no clue the size of them and the scope and scale. But they, again, knew that many would be former military personnel, and having high-ranking captured military officials as well as also political officials would assist in effectively acquiring additional intelligence that they didn't already possess through their other means, and use this through their intel analysts and real-time AI battlefield data processing system to craft their occupation plans as a result. As, again, the value of these personnel in terms of their intelligence value would go on beyond just the invasion phase and would go into the occupation phase, as these forces were wanted alive. As the secondary objective being securing their segment of I-30 that passed through this area of operations of the 59th Special Operations Battalion. This would be conducted between 3:30 and 3:40 by these forces moving to secure their segment of the I-30 highway, as the cordon forces of three other companies that were cordoning the southern part of the pocket, while the other three cordoned the north and eliminated that pocket, they would hold their positions, and then at 3:30, between 3:30 and 3:40, they would move into this area and thoroughly capture and secure the high-ranking individuals, the high-value targets or high-value individuals, and they would also not only cut them out surgically, like removing a tumor, they would also destroy those defending them, such as Alpha Company, which were logistical troops from the 949th Brigade Support Battalion. As this pocket had been eliminated with only the Bravo Company and small groupings of armed reactionary civilians remaining that were all cut down by a combination of heavy machine gun fire as these forces moved into this area, and this platoon swung around of MRAPs. They cut these forces down with heavy machine gun fire. Mortars landed on these personnel, destroying them and their homes that they had been hiding in. Dismounts had also fought their way through these forces with massive sniper support, FPV drone support, mortar support, and combat robot support in this particular area, fighting against the Bravo Company as they had effectively swung around and pincered these remaining forces again to their rear. There were steady attacks from fire missions being conducted by the Type 83 MLRS firing batteries from the two different Type 83 battalions from the 19th Artillery Brigade. So this also became a terrain denial mission, so they could not flee from being cut off and completely annihilated by mortar strikes, FPV drone strikes, and heavy machine gun and HJ-08 ATGM fire, and combat robot fire, and sniper spotter fire whenever and wherever applicable, as they would conduct, again, a 45-minute security sweep of the area after the 45-minute-long battle had ended. This would take them to 2:30, and between 2:30 and 3:30, they would effectively conduct their logistical resupply operations with the headquarters and support company, trucking in additional ammunition and supplies and fuel and more, and moving into position to assist in cordoning an ever smaller shrinking pocket, with the other two companies that had been further out able to fold in on this area as well behind this company, which had initially interdicted the flight of Bravo and Delta in the north, with the other company having, in the south, of the first two to arrive, having spread out and stopped the flight of the command staff of the HHC, and also Alpha Company with them, as by now the headquarters and support company's dedicated combat drone section was able to set up and fire their first volley of 48 CH-901As. These, being fired at 3:30, would circle the battlefield and hit many targets. By the time this map opens up at 3:40, these forces have now moved into position. There would be 10 combat robots deployed, as one would move with this rolling T formation to secure this highway overpass bridge through this neighborhood consisting of slightly more upscale homes than what was found in this area to the south, as this was a quadplex apartment complex like that which is featured here next to a gas station. This area was abutted by, again, an empty lot of hills with a street moving through the area on this side and one on the other side, as featured here. As a street moved here, another street here. This is the gas station, quadplexes. These are stores right here and here, as this was a hilly lot with sparse vegetation, tall grass and trees, which had a slope on the other side as well, with a more slight slope on this side. Armed combat robot here and the squad moving through the area, reminiscent of this operation right here. They would engage very tiny groupings of armed reactionary civilians, as two would be cut down in the parking lot, one with a pump-action shotgun, the other with a simple pistol, and others would be cut down in this hilly terrain, as there were only several of them here trying to put up a resistance. Most of them, by this point, had been defeated in terms of the armed reactionary civilian elements. As these forces moved down into this area, they had cut down virtually all the rest that were in between these two portions of the pocket, and all that really remained was the remnants of the Alpha Company, which had moved in originally with the elements of the HHC. And these forces had now become mixed up with most of the HHC forces being in the public housing projects. And although there were a few Alpha Company elements in this area as well, such as their M88 armored recovery vehicle, and they also had Alpha Company and some HHC forces mixed up together in the metal recycling plant. And of course, there was the shopping center, which had a grocery store and 2 other stores, and an automobile repair shop in this lot right here. All of it on very hilly terrain in this area, as there were hilly areas to the north of I-30 and hilly areas to the south, like so, including the hills that surrounded and even were within the project slightly, with the brick buildings being seen by the general as the best place to set up his temporary command center, because he was unable to flee the area and make it safely to the Naval Air Station, which by now had already fallen, as that had fallen already before 2 a.m. These forces were now completely and totally trapped and were about to be surgically cut out again like a tumor, as these forces moved in to seize control of their segment of I-30, which was their secondary operation, as this was seen as a possible key logistical route and troop movement route, especially into the occupation, as all highways in the area would be seen as valuable, although I-35 E and W were the most valuable of all the highways, as these were prime objectives. This was a secondary objective, as this was I-30, and it would be seized by special operations troops moving into the area to take control of it. As in this particular image, this combat robot is offering heavy fire support to allow this wedge formation to advance as they are cutting down opposition on the other side. There's even an FPV drone and the quadcopter squad-level reconnaissance drone mapping the area ahead in real time, allowing for the FPV drone operators to target enemy personnel wherever they're found. As there were many of these in flight, these would continually be operated throughout the course of this operation, as these too were a very surgical weapon, much like the loitering munitions, which were jet-powered, the CH-901As, and these combination of destructive kamikaze weapons, be they the FPV drones or the loitering munitions, would surgically wreak havoc on the opponents discovered in this area, the defending forces, as these EQ-2050s of one company were moving into the area at the opening of this map, as it's now 3:40 when this map opens up. These forces will have secured I-30, including with another platoon just to the slight west and off the map, securing their segment of I-30, as this company had moved into the area along with elements of the Heavy Special Weapons Company, setting up on the very hilly lot containing the old schoolhouse. There was also a sniper spotter team that would take position inside of the schoolhouse itself and would assist their troops with a QBU 10 12.7 millimeter sniper rifle in place of this JS or Jianxi 7.62 by 54 millimeter sniper rifle. As in the schoolhouse, similar scenes to this, although they would be using other types of furniture such as desks and other items to position their weapons and spotting equipment on. It would be a similar scene to this, where they are setting up here to prepare to assist their troops operating out in the field by offering them precision sniping support, as the forces elsewhere that were dismounted would be clearing buildings in the area, much like this painted stucco building, this quadplex apartment building here. They would be moving through in their stack teams and methodically clearing the buildings and ensuring that there were no enemy combatants contained therein, as this had also been a feature of the security sweeps that had occurred after the outside battle was concluded with the Bravo Company and armed reactionary civilians. They had spent another 45 minutes thoroughly clearing all the buildings in this area and raking over the rubbled area to ensure that there were no survivors anywhere in hiding. As they had done this, the other companies had folded in and effectively took their place in this area while this company continued into the south, bordering I-30 to secure the highways. They're part of the operation, as the cordon had now shrunk and the southern part of the pocket was now shrinking, with the mixture of the HHC and Alpha Company as a direct result of a lack of communications capabilities due to the tandem anti-SAT cyber strikes and electronic warfare that was jamming their radio equipment. These forces had become mixed up and had become dispersed through the area, and as they could be seen everywhere by the high-altitude reconnaissance assets, all the way down to the quadcopter assets, and all the way up above all of these to the satellite assets, all overlaying to make a full real-time picture of the ever-changing, ever-evolving modern fluid battlefield, plotting enemy and allied positions by the literal second as was being processed through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, completing the feedback loop by showing on the combat data links, which were both vehicle-based and squad sergeant-based, where enemy forces were at all times, as well as also where allies were at all times, using this also as a means of communication and also a means by which to operate their quadcopter squad level assets or vehicle crew assets. This combat data link system was highly advanced, to say the least. This is absolutely real technology. China and even Russia absolutely possess this technology, and we're now using it in this enormous, gargantuan invasion of the United States. As at the opening of this map, the mechanized infantry company had arrived and would dismount one of its 3 combat platoons, as its headquarters platoon was further back in the column, which were the command and logistical elements of this company. The dismounted squads would directly support the operation unfolding in the projects, as the projects were now surrounded by a single combat platoon from this company now entering, which had originally cordoned this side, but now could move in this area directly and begin to slice through it and effectively conduct a Moti-like operation, like the Finnish army had conducted against the Soviets in the Winter War between the USSR and Finland. This Moti-like operation would effectively be the special operators moving in and cutting up these elements into little sections where they could be isolated and thoroughly destroyed and or rooted out, such as what was occurring against the general and his staff in the public housing projects. As one of 3 of the combat platoons of this company moving in had moved into the area surrounding the projects, they had taken positions behind the shotgun shacks in the street here, sending in a staggered column formation up against the hills, as they had laid down heavy fire support from behind these buildings with a combination of small arms, 35mm grenade fire, rocket-propelled grenade fire from Type 69s, even HJ-08 fire every so often, such as how they destroyed this MRAP, which pulled within the field of fire of an HJ-08 strike, as they could just slightly see the vehicle over some of this hilly terrain, as the hills were varied in this area. As loitering munition strikes and 2 FPV drones had come in to hit targets, they had absolutely destroyed these forces on the perimeter, as they supported the movements along with this HJ-10 strike from this Wingling 2, also hitting vehicles and troops in this area surgically, assisting the movement of these squads toward their final objective. As they would arrive into the projects, they would have had mortar strikes coming in from the freshly moved mortar platoon element of the heavy special weapons company that had moved into this area, along with FPV drone operators that had taken position here, and a sniper spotter team now inside the freshly cleared old schoolhouse building. And the QBU-10, with its 12.7mm ammunition, could easily reach the projects, as this was on higher terrain, and the building was tall enough as well that the top floor was an outstanding sniping area for a sniper spotter team to set up within, as they could easily with the QBU-10, as this is the JS 7.62 by 54 millimeter rifle, bolt action. The QBU-10 was, of course, larger and fired a more powerful round, and they could hit targets within the projects that they could see that were not behind buildings or obstructed by hills. And with the combination of the sniper spotter team fire, the loitering munition strikes, the FPV drone strikes coming in from the FPV drones, and the quadcopter assets of all these different elements, these squads from the special operations standard operator squads, from the mechanized infantry squads and vehicle crews, and also even the heavy special weapons company forces had their own quadcopter assets operating in the area, assisting in mapping the area in real time. All these forces were easily seen, as again, above all of the quadcopter assets were the high altitude surveillance drones, and above them were satellite. So all of this was easily seen and mapped in real time, and these loitering munitions were able to strike their targets with ease. As this company that had been cordoning this side, as there were three companies cordoning the southern part of the pocket originally, for these three companies had folded down into the area here after first eliminating the northern pocket. This pocket had now shrunk into a 1 mile by 1 mile area, and the company that had been cordoning this area had now folded in to surround this area as the mechanized infantry had moved in, and the other company would simply just hold their position in the original positioning just to the south of the pocket, allowing these troops to move in of the mechanized infantry to offer small assistance, even though they were not needed, as the cordoning company in the south could have remounted up their troops or simply sent their troops up through the streets along with their MRAPs and EQ 2050s to clear this area. The arrival of this mechanized infantry company deploying first a platoon coming from their lead vehicles, their lead combat platoon, their lead 5 vehicles, their ZBDO-4A IFV, and their 4 Type 89As, deploying squads to move through this area of shotgun shacks and slightly larger homes on this street and clear it, as these FPV drones were supporting these mechanized infantry troops coming from the FPV drone operators from the heavy special weapons company elements having had moved their position. These had been hit, these MRAPs from the Alpha Company, and destroyed by these FPV drones, as these squads also had heavy machine gun fire support from their Type 89As, which were much heavier vehicles than were the lighter MRAPs operated by the special operators. And the ZBDO-4A's firepower was simply massively destructive, with their 100 millimeter main gun, 30 millimeter autocannon, 2 HJ09 ATGMs on the side pods on the turret, and of course a 7.62 by 54 millimeter coaxial machine gun. As this double column formation coming from this lead platoon, this rolling T formation moving up the street, this squad moving up this direction from the lead platoon, and this squad moving down to the south to cover this side, would move through the area, assisting the movement of this company down this street as they cleared the flanks on either side, just to be sure, as again, the other cordoning company of these special operators was just to the south of the positioning of the arriving mechanized infantry, and there was a small area of streets that were in between their positions, between the special operators and the mechanized infantry company that was arriving. So they had sent a squad to clear this area just to ensure that there were no enemy personnel hiding in some of these buildings, such as these game rooms and shotgun shacks and stores that were on the street. As they arrived into the parking lot of the shopping center, they deployed their second platoon out of their vehicle to engage any remaining forces that were hiding out in these areas, the vehicle repair center, as well as also the automotive shop and the shopping center. As they had arrived in an area that had been heavily mortared by the ISR real-time AI battlefield data processing system directed 82 millimeter mortar strikes that had landed in this area and destroyed many enemy personnel, along with loitering munition strikes. And the arrival of the special operating company in the north would deploy a platoon of dismounts with a combat robot from the Heavy Special Weapons Company to engage any survivors in this group, as they had all been engaged by personnel from this company that were on the other side of I-30, along with elements of the Heavy Special Weapons Company, two of their heavily armed combat robots on the other side of the highway, securing it, laying down fire on these personnel in the metal recycling plant, and this building, which is part of the campus of the metal recycling plant, and destroying these forces with a combination of mortar strikes in this area, FPV drone strikes. There were also sniper spotter team support in this once they arrived in the schoolhouse top floor that would cover this area, and this area, as this platoon from this company now moving into this area to clear these apartments, the gas station, sending also heavy Special Weapons Company robot support into this area with this company of standard operators moving through the area. They would clear the apartment complex and the gas station, as mentioned, and they would then, upon arriving atop the hill, lay down supporting fire for their other combat platoon of operators who were now on the edges of the projects and about to move in to secure alive the commanding general, his XO, his command sergeant major, and other members of his inner staff, as these were seen as HVTs within the HHC of the 56th Infantry Brigade Combat Team. As this platoon had surrounded the projects, again, 2 squads breaking into 2 stack teams each, taking position on this street on the other side of these shotgun shacks, firing around them with a variety of weapons, again, small arms, all the way to Type 69 fire to HJ-08 ATGM fire, covering the arrival of this staggered column formation on the edges of the hills, who now begun to lay down fire into the area from their position, along with on the hilltop firing over them into the projects. And now this squad, which had originally come around this way from this same platoon, and this squad, also part of the platoon, were now moving in to secure their grand prize, namely the capture of the Brigadier General, the Full-Bird Colonel, which was his XO, and again, the Command Sergeant Major, if possible, and others. And now, as these forces moved in, they started to effectively clear buildings in the projects after all the vehicles had been surgically annihilated by the strikes from the HJ-10s, from the Wingling 2, the CH-901As, the FPV combat, or the FPV drones, which were kamikaze weapons, and they would come in and hit all these vehicles that had set up on the perimeter to protect the general and his staff, as well as fire coming from these squads, tactical L-vectored fire into the projects. And now, as they would hold their fire after eliminating surgically all the forces on the edges of the projects, eliminating their perimeter defenses, would now move in to secure their prize, as these 2 squads would move directly into the projects and now would begin to clear them after heavy mortar strikes, again, FPV drone strikes, CH-901A loitering munition strikes, HJ-10 strikes, and now would be assisted by sniper fire in addition to all the other strikes that had already come in before, with, again, the heavy machine gun equipped quad-legged robots now on the hill with these troops that had been firing down into the area using, again, everything from 35mm grenades to Type 69s, which were the rocket-propelled grenades, to HJ-08 fire, and heavy machine gun fire from the quad-legged robots into this area. They surgically picked everything apart as the general was in this building, as his vehicle, upon having had parked in this area, which this was his vehicle that was destroyed by an HJ-08 strike from this half squad here, upon rolling into view. He had already dismounted from his vehicle with his other staff members moving from their vehicles, which were MRAPs and this up-armored Humvee, into this building. And as they would all be captured together, this squad, upon this squad arriving into the projects and clearing the first building and then breaking up, as there would be an arrow going over this area, clearing this building, they would then move in on this building together after the fire had ceased on the edges and capture the general alive. As they moved through the projects initially on both sides,
they would have to engage some of the few survivors after all the vehicles have been destroyed through a variety of fire. Again, anti-armor rounds from the Type 69 RPGs, such as what occurred here, blasting this piece of engine out, along with throwing the cover of the engine cover over in this direction, as well as cracking the windshields and also maiming the personnel inside, which would be captured alive, along with some of the other personnel who would ultimately surrender after seeing all the surgical destruction coming in from all of these different weapon systems, as these teams, these fire teams of these elite special operators moving in their stack team formations to clear these project buildings would move through surgically, methodically, and eliminate any enemy personnel inside that were not on their HVT capture list, unless they had ultimately surrendered and thrown down their arms, as they would take prisoners in this instance as they moved through the area tactically in their different tactical formations. Again, the troops on the outer perimeters would hold their fire as their capture teams of stack team formations moved methodically through the area toward the general's location to capture him alive. So again, this squad moved in from the south, then moved on to this building, cleared it, and then moved out, preparing to lay down supporting fire to allow this squad to move in and capture the general, as again, these forces would surrender. These would be wiped out as they had tried to flee in this direction. They would be cut down as they tried to exchange fire with this squad, which was supporting the movement of this squad. As this squad had been in this position on the side of the hills, on the side of the projects, they had been laying down fire into this area. Some of these forces had fled over here and would ultimately surrender. As this arrow is not encapsulated in green, these would become POWs. They would surrender. These forces would enter this project building and would surrender as well. These forces too, as all these forces outside were surgically annihilated through the use of the 82mm mortar strikes, which damaged the facades of some of the project buildings, but they were very cautious when it came to the general's building, and this mortar strike would have been over in this area here, which would have damaged this MRAP partially, shredding its tires and damaging its frontal engine, allowing for it to be destroyed by this squad as they moved into the area and fired an ATGM at it. Again, as this MRAP would be hit by a Type 69 RPG. Also, these vehicles being hit by a combination of FPV drones, loitering munition strikes from CH-901As equipped with HE warheads. Also, these very powerful yet very surgical ATGMs, the HJ-10s, coming in and destroying all these vehicles, as again, it was not uncommon for multiple systems to hit the same vehicle, as these forces tried to return fire against those on the hill. And over at the troops in these areas, the withering fire that was returned upon them, especially once they moved into this position, could lay down L-vectored fire with these troops firing over them, sniper fire support coming in from the schoolhouse, hitting personnel that were not behind these buildings, mortar fire support coming in, FPV drones, loitering munitions, HJ-10s, and HJ-08s and Type 69s from these troops, 35mm grenade fire. All of it was highly surgical, and very few survived it, except for those that made it into these buildings and were then captured alive by these troops. It's difficult to show the red arrow moving to these buildings to take these forces, as this area was full of icons of enemy vehicles, personnel, explosions from mortars, etc. But after capturing the general alive, who would throw down his arms and surrender, including his entire staff, they would then move on and capture these troops alive after they would clear out the entire public housing projects. They would continue moving through in their stack teams after one squad would remove the targets from the projects and would effectively zip tie them and place them within their MRAPs to be removed, or within their EQ 2050s, as all of this combat had been very heavy in this area. Again, a wide array of surgical precision means utilized to remove the combat and security vehicles of these forces, such as their up-armored Humvees and their MRAPs, along with even destroying their logistical vehicles, such as their trucks, like their LMTVs and heavy equipment transporter trucks or HETs, and their fuelers, which were also destroyed, their fuel trucks, their M88 armored recovery vehicles, etc. These would all, again, be surgically removed before these squads moved in to eliminate any straggling forces, like in this image here. Some would fire out of the buildings but would be wiped out, trying in vain to defend the high-ranking personnel inside. And some of these surviving troops that had been on the other side of some of these buildings and moved through the area were simply cut down as they moved in. Again, the tactical expertise of these special forces troops could not be understated, as they, again, L-vectored their fire. Again, these troops were safe behind hills before they had tactically moved in, with all the fire support having annihilated all the major vehicles, allowing for them to move in and eliminate any personnel that had gotten in their way and tried to return fire. They would be cut down, as these buildings would also be cleared. As they would go through the buildings, they would encounter some soldiers that would try to resist, but for the most part, the command staff knew what was best for themselves, and they ultimately surrendered and were taken alive. The executive officer would pull his pistol but have it knocked out of his hand and be rifle checked in the face, as the PLA personnel of the Special Operations Forces moved through in their stack teams. As they rushed into the room he was hiding in, he would pull his pistol, but again, because he was wanted alive, he would have it knocked out of his hand and rifle checked in the face, so he would have a bruised face, but he would be zip-tied and taken nonetheless. Everyone else would surrender without incident, as these buildings were thoroughly cleared. As the combat in the projects, being the finale of this operation, was exceedingly heavy but surgical all at once, the fighting in other areas would involve the arrival of these special operators conducting their moties, cutting off these different areas, as many of these vehicles, such as those in the gas station, were destroyed by precision strikes from loitering munitions and FPV drones in some of these neighborhoods, as these vehicles tried to take up positions to be able to watch different sectors of fire. They would be destroyed by FPV drones, loitering munition strikes, as the moties would be conducted, as the rest of this company would move in after deploying a platoon here, as they had another platoon in this area, as they deployed them, as they moved their vehicles around to conduct their operation to slice through the Alpha Company and HHC defenses. This double column rolling shield formation with an armed robot in front of them would be deployed into this area after all these vehicles had been surgically destroyed by these FPV drones, negating their capability to fire, as this particular MRAP in this image has been hit by two FPV drones, one actually going into the gunner's hatch and blowing up inside of the vehicle, the other hitting toward the front, completely throwing this vehicle in multiple pieces. This one having had accelerants inside, such as white phosphorus grenade rounds or Willie Pete grenade rounds, which were illumination rounds, having had caught parts of the vehicle on fire and igniting after being hit by an HJ-10 or an HJ-08 ATGM rather, as 82mm mortars, repeated hits would pummel buildings, including this one that these troops eventually took position in, as the rest of their squad is in the first floor, what was remaining of it, and they got onto this ledge that used to be a top floor as the roof was blown out and most of the walls. They fired ATGMs such as this HJ-08. They had their light anti-armor weapons such as their Type 69s and more. This light machine gunner was firing at this gunner and would actually hit the gunner, as these were, again, excellent shooters, whether they were operating their standard rifles such as their QBZ-95s, their light machine guns such as their QBJ-201s, or their sniper rifle equipment such as their JS or Jianqi 7.62x54mm bolt-action rifles, or QBU-10 12.7mm rifles. These were outstanding shooters, even with their heavy machine guns on their turrets, such as their 12.7mm W85s. As now the motifs had been complete and these forces had been cut into segments, including using the mechanized infantry in the south, these forces would move through the area also offering mutual support to the special operators, clearing out the projects by moving through other streets and ensuring that they had been thoroughly cleared, as the mechanized infantry would move through the area in their own tactical formations and clear it as their vehicles continued on to the shopping center to deploy yet another platoon from their 3 combat platoons of their company. They would move through and secure this area. These forces that had survived would ultimately surrender and be taken as POWs. Some were from the Alpha Company, some from the HHC. It was a mix in this area, again, due to lack of communications. These forces broke into different groups as they had a hard time staying together in proper formation. As heavy firepower came in from across the highway as well, from the combat troops of the standard special operating companies, such as the company that had moved in from taking the northern portion of the pocket, assisted by their combat robots, FPV drones, and sniper support, and mortars as well, from 82 millimeter mortar fire, such as what was happening in this area. The FPV drones and heavy machine gun fire in particular ravaged the forces in this pocket before the MOT had been complete, and a squad with the combat robot had been deployed into this area to secure it, as they would then move in and clear the metal recycling plant and engage several troops that were taking a position inside that had actually made it inside, as the rest holding the perimeter in this hilly terrain were simply wiped out over time, as there was a lengthy firefight between these forces until the FPV drones were introduced and destroyed the vehicle-based firepower, such as their MRAPs, and this company had moved in to assist in cutting off this area and deployed a whole platoon of troops with a combat robot in to secure this part of the area, clearing these buildings. All these buildings would be thoroughly cleared as these forces tried to flee in this MRAP and this dismounted squad. Before this squad, an armed robot, moved in, the heavy machine gun equipped vehicles had effectively shredded those troops and the vehicle to pieces upon firing an HJ-08 at the Max Pro MRAP, as again they carried multiple of these anti-tank guided missiles in their MRAPs and EQ-2050s. Also, again, they also carried light anti-armor weapons such as the Type 69s. Having had effectively concluded this operation, clearing these areas here in the south, as the mechanized infantry had cleared the shopping center area and the automotive repair shop, taking prisoners, the combination of these forces totally cutting off these areas like so made it impossible for these forces to escape, and they were either all destroyed or were taken POW. The operation being a resounding success, as the public housing projects, as combat was heavy yet surgical in this area, would see many of the troops of this platoon, of this particular operator company, receiving large awards for their participation in this very high value, high stakes operation. Even as all of this lasted until 4:30 a.m., as this was very surgical and methodical, and combat in the projects was heavy and savage, and combat to seize the highway was as well as a secondary objective. The fighting going on throughout the rest of the city was also quite massive, as combat engineers in the east of the city were conducting a pocket clearance operation of their own in the Pleasant Grove Balch Springs area of the city. This combat initiating at about 1 a.m. as well, after a large 300 millimeter rocket barrage had ravaged this area, fired by the PHL-03 Battalion of the 19th Artillery Brigade, as the Special Operations Mission and many other operations were going on by 1 a.m., including wrapping up the destruction of the Naval Air Station, as the operation in the Balch Springs / Pleasant Grove area was occurring, the combat engineers were surrounding the area, having been freshly destroyed by 300 millimeter fire as a large grouping of armed reactionary civilians had emerged out of their homes with weapons in hand, deemed a threat. The real-time AI battlefield data processing system had put together the strike package for the 300 millimeter artillery battalion to have one of its firing batteries completely ravage this area of Dallas. And as a result, the combat engineers would have to go in and clear this rubbled, ruined area with their high-tech equipment, as they, like the special operators, used enormous amounts of robotic forces, and also they had their engineering vehicles for this task. As these combat engineers were like elite assault infantry, they were the perfect forces to root out these resistors in this area. As again, clearing the flanks for other operations that were ongoing was highly important. And the mechanized infantry battalion from the 16th Infantry Division moving through this area was clearing the Oak Cliff area. While they were doing so, they would arrive and assist the combat engineers in their operation occurring in the Balch Springs / Pleasant Grove area, which again, this began at 1 a.m. after a 1-hour 300 millimeter artillery barrage. Even as all of this was occurring, the two companies from the 1st of the 124th Cav were retreating from the area as the battalion of light mechanized infantry from the 24th Light Infantry Brigade and the armored battalion from the 35th Armored Brigade, tasked with destroying the Naval Air Station, had caused these forces to retreat, and they would be pursued and surrounded and destroyed. As after the Naval Air Station had been completely annihilated, the same forces that had effectively assaulted the Naval Air Station would be redeployed against the retreating two companies, as that would begin at a later time, the surrounding, the encircling, the envelopment of these surviving two companies. The actions occurring in Balch Springs, among other areas, had begun first, as many operations began within the first hour or by 1 a.m. There would be many residual combat occurrences that would occur throughout the area following these aforementioned operations. More to come in the next installation of this hypothetical documentary series highlighting fourth-generation warfare doctrines utilizing a Sino-Russian coalition invasion of America. In the next installation, the Battle of Balch Springs and Pleasant Grove. Next.